Hello, my name is Miguel Almario, and welcome to Speak. This is a show about empowering people in their mental health journey, and if you want to support us, please consider following our club's social media at the I Am Collective, also on YouTube now at the I Am Collective. This episode is about finding cause, making change, culture, and perspective, and I hope you enjoy the show today. So, I hope you're having an amazing week whenever you do end up listening to this. We kind of have a huge backlog, so I'm not even quite sure what the episode order is going to be like, but as always, we are trying to get as many interesting people on here as possible, and that has been a very easy task. And that makes me proud to say. As well as this, we're hoping to kind of transition to episodes weekly. So hopefully at this point, that's already been started. But uh, in that same vein, hope you're not getting tired of me because that would be unfortunate. And as I did say earlier, we are always lucky to have such interesting guests. And today we continue that trend with a friend named Isa. And I'll let Isa introduce herself.
Hi, so my name's Isa. I'm a fourth year international relations and global development studies student. While I have been on a bit of a study break because I've been on a work term with global affairs since the start of January. So that's been very exciting. Um, I moved here to Canada in 2011, so it's been around 9 years. I'm originally from Cochabamba, Bolivia, so that's a fun thing about me. And sort of how I kind of know Miguel is I'm the president of a student club named Pangaea. So Pangaea is basically a student club that focuses on cultural diversity and on supporting immigrant and refugee newcomers. So yeah, that's just a little blurb about me.
Yeah, and right before we started, recording the episode, I always mentioned that the introduction's the weirdest part for a lot of people because it's like, oh, I have to go talk about myself now. But yeah, I hope it kind of draws a very clear parallel to the ideas of culture and who Isa is and what Pangea is about. And we're hoping to, build that relationship and talk more at length about why things like culture and how they shape your understanding of the world are very important, not only in the grander concept, but also in mental health. And alongside that comes the idea of self acceptance and understanding yourself better, because that helps you understand the world better. So, that is basically at length what we're going to be discussing today. And the first kind of big bucket of that is culture as a determining factor. Now, specifically honing into it, I'm of the belief that culture is the biggest thing when it comes to shaping your perspective. And of course, there's a bunch of different elements to that. There's family, there's societal position, economic position, your friends, who you surround yourself with, your education decision, your interests. There are a lot of things that could sway how you perceive the world, but culture ends up being the backbone of all those things because regardless if you're with a close knit group of five people, you're a close knit group of five people that live in Canada and are governed by Canada's rules and the histories and whatnot. So, in a lot of ways, culture ends up providing a lot of context to where we are in the grand scheme of things and who we are in relation to other people. So, the first thing I want to ask is, on the note of determining factors and of the note of shaping your identity and shaping your perception, Issa, what do you think about culture? I know you have some things to say, obviously.
Yeah, so I think for me, like culture has always been a very like something I spend a lot of time like thinking about. And I think that comes along with being like a first gen immigrant. I think like every person that it's like either first gen, even if you moved there when you were like six to when you were like 13, which is when I moved. Um, I remember in high school, there's always like those personal essays, and it's like, what is a big defining moment in your life? And everyone that's like an immigrant is like, when I moved to Canada, like my world was turned upside down. So, and I think for me, I kind of have a really unique sort of like maybe a little, I'm kind of like an exception on certain things when it comes to culture because um like half of my life really was spent in Bolivia versus I think a lot of like sort of my other immigrant friends or like Latino friends. It's like they were mostly raised here, but they had a really strong like Colombian community or like Filipino community. But with me, it's kind of like the first half of my life was spent there, and I was very like unaware of my own culture, like just sort of growing up, because I don't think you really question it as a kid. And then once I moved here, and I sort of like, it was like a complete like 180. And I was lucky because I knew English already. I had already like known it's easier to know about Canadian culture than it is for like a Canadian to know about Bolivian culture. So then I feel like I assimilated like really quickly here, just because I kind of had like some knowledge of what it was. I had like, American interest already, and like I had the language down. So I think those aren't things that a lot of immigrants kind of have on their bag, or like those were things that kind of made the transition a little easier. But it very much is like sort of like this two identity, like identity crisis I've had like for like most of my life, or like especially in like the last couple years. And I think that's also because the Bolivian community here is like pretty small. Like I know around like maybe like 5 to 10 other people. So kind of like I think I've had to like connect more with like the Latino community in large, just to like find that sense of like belonging. And when I was sort of thinking about what culture meant to me, and like what was my culture and how that's influenced me, I think I always tend to go like to those like really obvious like cultural like notes, like sort of the food and the dances, and like the traditions. But then I think like the main thing about culture is like it's hard to pin down how culture has really affected you. Well, it's like, yeah, those are obvious, like I can look back on my childhood and I remember the food, and I remember like the carnivals, and like I remember like different things that I went through. I think like my culture is really impacted in a way where like I still don't really understand it, where it's kind of like I think it's impacted how I see like my place in the world, how I like connect with other people, what my idea of like relationships are, what idea of like my respect is. So it's really hard to like really pin down, because it's kind of like what part of this is what I was brought up, what part of it is a Canadian value, what part of it is a Bolivian value, and like what part of it is just like who I am. So I think it's definitely like a really like complex like sort of relationship in
Hmm.
general.
And yeah, I can only really speak my own experience, but there was a lot of uh, themes there that were relevant and also crossed over with my experience as well, in terms of uh, my history as an immigrant, and kind of reflecting on the upbringing a bit. Uh, I, I was first born in Manila, and this is gonna go somewhere, I promise. But I was born in Manila, and early enough or I moved early enough that I could, not exactly. Uh, y- it wasn't a difficult transition, but it was something that I still have like bits and pieces of in my memory. But I didn't actually move to Canada first. I moved from Manila to Singapore, and so it was weird being around one, the the kind of environment difference, just in terms of like, okay, the Philippines is in this bubble, Singapore ended up being in that bigger bubble, and then from Singapore moving to Canada, it's this is going to play into a bigger piece, I have to say, about the value system. And I think when it comes to culture, one of the biggest things I noticed growing up is how values kind of govern understanding in a lot of ways. Because when I compare and contrast my upbringing in Singapore versus here, there are things that are really heavily emphasized, like individual responsibility is huge in, especially in Asian cultures. So it ends up being something that you you have in the back of your mind, where you're constantly compared to your peers on the basis of your individual performance. And when it comes to like cultural upbringing, that was the weirdest thing to transition here. I remember like I ended up moving to Canada when I was in third grade, so I was maybe like 8 or 9, and it was, yeah, again, still early enough to remember what life was like, but still late enough that assimilation was pretty easy and also entirely within my control. And that led to a very weird situation where uh I understood that, where I came from, it was very strict. And I also had that further background of like, there's not a lot of money here. You got to work very hard for a certain sort of thing. And then in Singapore, my family was in a much better economic state. So then that kind of slips a bit, that realm of thinking or that importance kind of slips a bit in the value system. And then you move to Canada, and the biggest thing I think I learned right away was the degree of opportunity in a bunch of different areas. And that was kind of weird to pin down because I had very much so associated uh, values and success and individual standing with a very particular set of skills like math or the ability to understand Cantonese. Very, very weird things that don't even apply to me anymore. But, you know, the biggest thing that I will loop back to is the idea of assimilation and how this entire foundation kind of led me when I came to Canada to just completely reject everything I was once a part of. So, and I think this is something that a lot of immigrants kind of sympathize with is when you kind of get faced with a new environment where everyone is a certain way, but there's a lot of freedom in it, there's a lot of choice in it. You kind of feel ashamed, or like, oh, I came from somewhere that isn't as good and now I don't know how to feel about where I'm from. And that is a very weird dynamic to play, especially when you're a young kid and you kind of have to constantly do this jumping and like, where do I fit in this grand scheme of things. It's just something that came out when you were talking about your experience moving to Canada, and I thought, wow, when it comes specifically to the assimilation piece, I remember myself actively rejecting that. A, I was Filipino. B, like, it was one of those things like I had seen almost, oh, this grass is greener, I'm happy you're here, I don't want to think about that. And it was an active choice to kind of reject it. And now that I'm getting older, I realize how much that doesn't leave you, that kind of sticks with you. And uh when as you kind of get older, and I think this is something that a lot of people can also resound with, that you kind of work your way back into connecting with your culture. And uh when it comes to the idea of relationships and how cultural background is kind of governed that, I want to pass it back to Isa. I've talked a lot already. Like, you know, this process of relearning sort of where you came from. How has that shaped you today and your actions and you know, your goals and such?
Yeah, no, I think you said some really interesting stuff that I can relate to as well. Mostly because when we lived in Bolivia, we were like very, like, we were well off, like we were really privileged. And, one thing with Bolivian culture that I've come to understand is this idea that, like you're responsible for your family. So you kind of have to, it's a very more like kind of collective sort of values than there is in Western. Like Western's very individualistic, and it's just how it is, and there's good things and bad things about it. But I think, yeah, when you're an immigrant and you move here and you're taught that you just have to care about kind of yourself, you do. And also because that's kind of the environment you're around, you immediately want to be like, oh, okay, yes, like this is who I am now. But also it was like a very big transition for me, just because we went from a place where we were very well off, we were very privileged, we never had to worry about money, nothing like that. We come here for opportunities, but our economic situation was basically the opposite. So we struggled a lot. We were basically low income. We're still low income. There's no shame in that, but that is like a big sort of transition to go as a kid from being like, in Bolivia with like two maids, like one live in, to, being in Canada, and like, yeah, the quality of life is better, but you also have to take more individual responsibility, like things are different. So I think that's, it's still, again, it's hard to say like how exactly that's like impacted me, but I think it really is giving me like a thought on like privilege and sort of like how I transitioned, and like what kind of factors, it's something I think about a lot, also because I'm white passing, or like, I'm a white Latina. it was a lot easier to assimilate as well, because if I, if I could mask my accent, if I could like, sort of like dress a certain way, I could very much, be your like typical Canadian person. But I think, like, you're definitely right, where like later on you sort of like grow up a bit, and you start to miss those, that connection to your culture. At least for me, it's been like a long, like, sort of like lots of reflections on like what it means to me to be Bolivian, like what my childhood was, what does that, mean for me now. But I think like, one of the main things that sort of like immigrating, or like this kind of balance of two cultures, is like, this is one of like the main things I relate to. It's like kind of like my main causes, because it's like one of the biggest things I spend time on, and I think it's one of the biggest like, the immigrant experience is one that like I can really speak to. So it's like, even though like I'm passionate about a lot of other social issues, I found that because I can speak to it so well, and because it's been like one of the experiences that's impacted me the most, then I can sort of talk about it more. It's kind of like my cause. So I think how it's impacted my relationships is it's made me more understanding. It's giving me like a bigger perspective on like what makes people who they are, and like especially when it comes to culture. But that's kind of why I got involved with Pangaea, which is my student club that I mentioned in the beginning. And I think one of the main reasons I kind of sought out Pangaea because I wanted to connect more and do more, for sort of like people that were in a similar situation as me, where they were still, integrating, they were still assimilating, they were still kind of like going through a lot of the challenges that immigrants face. So I remember like going on the SU Club Hub and looking up like immigrant club, like refugee clubs, things like that. And that was the first, honestly, the only one that really spoke to me. So, I volunteered with them as like a mentor. And then eventually I was an executive. And I always say like I inherited the club just because I didn't start it, but it was basically started by this group of friends that were really moved by the Syrian refugee crisis, and they wanted to do something to support immigrants and refugees and newcomers in general. But I really believe in the message, especially when it comes on just having more open discussions about culture and its importance, how important it is, especially in Canada, because we have this idea that like Canada is like a multicultural country, like, everyone is free to practice their own culture, which is like, it's in federal law, but I think in practice, it's not that simple. You still have a lot of sort of like, immigrants or other, especially when they're not white immigrants or European immigrants. So that's just something that is like, it's not as simple as maybe Canadian propaganda wants you to believe. And also mentorship. I think with this mentorship, I came in with sort of my experience about like what it's like to be an immigrant, and what are like the needs and what are the struggles and what is my culture like, or like Latino culture in total. But through this mentorship, I was able to really get to know Syrian culture, which is something that I had no friends that were from Syria. I had no like close relatives. I went to a Catholic school. So it's like, even though, we're pretty multicultural, I didn't really have a lot of friends that were from that background. So I just really got to know like a culture that was like completely unlike mine. And I honestly think I'm better off from it. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why like I'm really passionate about keeping Pangea going, is because, I really see, the value and like the benefit that like understanding other people, especially, other cultures in Canada in particular, and like how valuable that is. So yeah, that's sort of like, I think it's my cultural background has shaped me a lot in almost every way.
That was beautiful. And
Mm.
I want to first start off going back to what you spoke about, the initial assimilation process and the experience for immigrants when they first show up. And show up is a weird term to use, but um, when I remember distinctly, there was like a very extended period of time where I would try and straighten my hair. I would try and comb it straight, as straight as possible, because that was, in my understanding, that's what I wanted. I aspired to be. I wanted to look a certain way. It was, I think it was specifically Justin Bieber hair time where, he had the bangs and whatnot. And yeah, I don't know, like little 11-year-old Miguel just really did not enjoy like the little kink in my hair or anything like that. And in you justify that really easily, and you justify that really well in the time of, well, I want to be like my friends. I want to make this achieve this sense of belonging here. And I think that in a lot of ways, you're in that moment, you're kind of blind to how, sad that situation ends up being, and like how real that is for a lot of people too, who I was experiencing that as a 9-year old who would go on to, understand that that isn't my only option. But then there are people who immigrate here later where they feel like that's their only option. And it's kind of really sad that way. But what does bring, a lot of hope and joy to my heart is one, the the reception that the majority of the people here are when it comes to inviting and accepting different cultures and different backgrounds. I think that it is unique, especially like trying to like sitting in my head and reflecting on, the different demographics of people I've seen. And Canada is very, this is going to end up being very, oh yeah, Canada's sick, but like um I think moving here, they do give you the system that would promote the most easy sort of cultural fit. Like it gives you the correct means to, still express who you are and do exactly uh by your culture what you aim to do, whether that is your like religion or your traditional practices. But then it's exactly what you said as well, where it is really easy to talk about that and say it as a concept, but it's really different when, I have a star that Filipinos put up every Christmas. And uh even though that's a really small thing, I reflect on that from time to time and think like, is it weird that we're doing that? And it's such a small, subconscious thing, but I still even question my culture to that extent. And like um knowing that it is the backbone of a lot of, my belief system and the way I've structured my values, that I still end up second guessing myself. I still end up, like antagonizing it a bit. So yeah, it is way harder to actually, get that mosaic that is so heavily pushed. And I think that for me, trying to rectify or understand that relationship was a very difficult process because, on one hand, I had made myself as this individual. And on another hand, the more and more I learn about my family and our background and, how that's sort of stems from, yeah, the colonial history of the Philippines and where that all comes from, then I start to realize like, hey, you can't really separate culture and identity. It's sort of ingrained in you, whether you like it or not. It ends up being kind of the blueprint. So that moves us now pretty succinctly on to identity as the endpoint. So we talked about how culture ends up being the first determining factor, and now once we've crossed that bridge, we made that understanding. We have to examine identity because that's eventually, what you end up displaying onto other people. And I think in a lot of ways too, this ends up being directly tied to society, and it ends up being a whole triangle. And in that sense, exactly what we've kind of been discussing with the way Canada has structured its system, that countries do a very specific or have a very specific goal when it comes to curating their culture. And they want to reach a very specific image and be an inviting force or not, depending on where you're from. And in a lot of ways it is to curate your culture in a way so that you can sort of create uh sort of an underlying theme for its citizens or an underlying identity. And this is definitely anecdotal. I'm not saying like, oh, I'm like a anthropologist, or that's not at all what it is. But that translates to a lot of pressure on the individual level because, especially as an immigrant, you're kind of contending with these different areas that you have different levels of attachment to. And where it kind of swings back around to mental health is that this entire process is very draining. And you know, one benefit of having the internet the way it is, you can kind of see the whole world. And one really big con is that if you identify with more than one group of people, you're absorbing everyone's problems. And now that entire weight is upon you. And this is something that um, I feel to certain degrees as a young immigrant that was here for a long time, that ideally doesn't have a lot of ties to my state back home. But there are also people who, again, have moved here as adults that directly feel what's going on elsewhere. And now they have to kind of thread this line. And it's entirely a burden that is so difficult to bear. And, confronting that and conforming to an overall culture can be a very weird way of addressing it, mitigating it, meeting it in the middle, where you kind of like subconsciously decide upon one or the other. And that's definitely not that's not a decision that anyone should make. And while Canada is super multicultural, there's still a lot of pressure to kind of assimilate back into the overall picture of Canada. And uh, it is a very fine line to kind of go back and forth. And there's a lot there to unpack. I apologize for giving you the whole word dump, but um, in terms of that dichotomy and playing with, Isa as a Canadian, Isa as a Bolivian, how have you kind of worked that, and what has been your ways of kind of navigating that, the two different worlds as healthy as possible? Because I guess that's the biggest endpoint.
Yeah, no, I think like I sort of said, it's like it's been like for as long as I really I think like the first couple years when I moved here, like my main focus was just also, you're 13, you're like a kid no matter like your background, like you want to fit in into like whatever group you're in. So like my main focus was always like, oh, I gotta fit in. And I don't think in like those points I didn't realize how fitting in really meant, kind of losing my culture a little bit. Like I have a lot of to the point where it's like I wasn't aware of it, and now I look back on some experiences I had with like sort of like friends or like frenemies or like like those like kind of bad relationships you have when you're in grade 8, where I'm like, oh, that was kind of messed up. Like I remember I used to have a crush on this guy, and I was going on a date with him like grade 8, and he comes up to me and he's like, hey, you're from Bolivia, right? And I'm like, oh yeah. And he's like, oh, like that's where they have a lot of cocaine, right? Like have you ever like seen cocaine? Like do you have some? And to me at the point I was like, because I liked this guy, I was like, ah, ha, 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 like so funny. But then years later I look back and I'm like, oh my god, that little shit, like how could he have just like said that to me? Like I just like it's like it baffles me. But at the time I was very much like, oh, ah, ha, ha, like I didn't even take it as an offense, because to me it was like, oh, you're Bolivian, you're different. That's like it's like a detail, like it makes you quirky, but like like don't take offense to these sort of things, because you're in a different context now. And I think it also really depends on the person. Like even within my family, like the way my mom has sort of like been impacted by like moving has been very different from like me or even my younger sister. Like I had like my younger siblings now don't really speak Spanish that much, and part of it is because they feel kind of embarrassed, they have an accent when they speak Spanish. But even like I have siblings that just they got made fun of their accent, and then they were like, okay, I'm not gonna speak Spanish because I don't want to have an accent. And that's really sad, because then language is like a really key part of like how you connect with culture. Like how are you supposed to talk with your family back home? How are you supposed to like really understand what's going on if you don't have a handle on the language? And honestly with me, like even though Spanish is my first language, I do see myself forgetting it a bit. And that is like terrifying. Like, my biggest, I went back once ever since I moved here, like in grade 9. And when I was back, I already had a little bit of an accent when I spoke Spanish. And, I got made fun of for it because, and like, the culture there's really straightforward. So I try not to like antagonize them a lot. But, it really made me feel like, okay, this isn't my culture anymore. I don't belong here. So I think that's sort of like, where you're kind of like pulled into directions. Like on one end, whenever I introduce myself to anyone, I'm like, oh, I'm Bolivian, this and that. I have like 4 siblings. Like, it's one of like the main things that I identify with. But sometimes, you feel like an imposter just because of like, oh, maybe my Spanish is not so well. Like, oh, I don't know like the latest like I don't know anything about Bolivian literature, like things like that, that like, in the grand scheme of things, don't really say much about who you are as a person, but they feel important because you feel like inadequate or like you don't belong in that culture. And then on the Canadian side, I kind of touched on it. It's like you have you still have sort of that pressure to like fit in, and you do change. Like that's the thing. It's not like assimilation does happen, integration does happen, and you do become more Canadian. And maybe that's gonna hurt like your family's relationships. Like for me, my mom is still like Bolivian through and through. Like she's Canadian like by citizenship, but she's always going to be Bolivian. Well, for me, I'm going to say, oh, Bolivian Canadian. So, there's a lot of like conflict of values, even like at your own home, that it's like, it's hard to deal with like from a mental health perspective. So I think one of the things that's really helped me is to not associate one as better than the other, right? So to not associate one as more superior or one is more important, because culture is like I think it's really important. It's a really important part of your identity, but it can have positive and it can have negative parts of it. Any culture in the world. So just kind of taking out like this narrative like, oh, this is good and this is bad, or this is bad and this is good, and just being like, this is what it is, this is what I've experienced, this is what I can speak to, takes like the pressure off. Because I think that's like one of like the main things. It's just like trying to be, especially I think with Bolivian culture, because it's like there's not too many of us there. I'm like, oh, I'm like, I have to represent Bolivians like for every person that I meet, because I'm probably the only person they've met from that country. And I think even like the way I kind of spoke about it, like a lot of people don't know where it is. It's not like Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, where it's kind of well known everywhere. So I always used to say, oh, it's like the poor man's Peru, just because like when you think of like, at least where I'm from, like the traditional culture, it's very similar to Peru. So that's not a lie. Like they share a lot of indigenous cultures, things like that. But I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't like diminish like my background like that, or like my ethnicity like that, by making it seem like it's lesser than. So that's something like I stopped doing kind of recently. And it's something definitely like I haven't figured it all out yet on like how I can kind of like stop like again like diminishing or like making it seem less important than it is. But yeah, it's tough. I think it's like a lot of unlearning. You learn and you unlearn, and that's kind of like, it's not just with culture, it's like with anything.
Hmm. And again, there's a lot of things that I resonated with as well. I think uh, primarily I want to go back to the the weird uh, trying to jump over some misunderstandings with people, and shortcut your ethnicity, your experience, by saying it's discount Peru or whatever. Like um I feel something very much so similar, and even like going back to the whole accent thing, like I've completely dropped off my dialect. And I think that in entire process of rediscovering what my identity as a Filipino person meant to me, really went into like uh the language that we speak, because predominantly the immigrants here, there are a lot of Filipinos everywhere, but there's a whole systematic thing for why that is the case, and I don't want to go into it. But um the the most common language spoken by Filipinos ends up being Tagalog. And uh my family is Bisaya, and my family speaks Bisaya, which is a very it's similar in form, but very very different, because it kind of is indicative of where in the Philippines you're from. And um there's a reason why phenotypically I kind of don't look a lot like Filipinos. And it even shows up in work and stuff, where sometimes people will see my name and then they'll go, "Oh, Miguel, como estás?" And it's like, well, that's not exactly, I'm not offended by it, but I kind of just have to, it'll be a problem if I bring it up, and that's the only time it becomes a problem. And it's this weird, uh, these like microaggressions that aren't really bad things, but at the same time, they do diminish the way that you value yourself more and more as you kind of keep accepting them. And um, you know it's weird because you don't want to be the antagonist in that sense. And even like going back to uh talking about the home life, like obviously I learn things outside as a Canadian person, then I come back and I want to share that with my family, and 9 times out of 10 they have something to say that is almost completely opposite, or very much so different lens, or I agree, but like that. These are conversations that happen all the time, and it creates exactly what you're saying, Issa, with that dynamic of you go outside and you're kind of playing two different worlds. You go inside and you're still playing two different worlds, and you kind of have this responsibility of like pulling in the new and introducing the old, and now you have to play this tightrope, and it is a stressful situation. And um, the one thing I will say though is I think it's getting better. And I think that the more that, things like Pangea exist, and that the experience in itself is better sort of introduced, and there's more of I wouldn't say like a landing zone almost, or like a process of, almost integration in relation to, like understanding how your perspectives fit and how your culture and identity sort of highlight and marry with, instead of are genetically opposed. You know what I mean? And I think that that is a weird dynamic that uh, a lot of people will move someplace and they'll automatically feel like the other, and that is something that I think a lot of groups try and prevent from happening now. And I think we are getting to a place where uh, the process is at least getting a little bit easier. And again, I want to acknowledge the fact that it's groups like Pangea that would do that. And it's the aim of you for certain to sort of make that an easier experience for people. And I think that I can almost resound with that in a different way, because culture, again, a part of you no matter what. And I think my translation of how I've kind of combated this whole thing is just to be very specific about mental health and look at, you know because the Philippine culture pretty weird, pretty messed up, and has a lot of uh pretty unfortunate colonial, atrocities in there. So I think that my whole understanding of it was sort of navigating the individual battle of like, okay, you are going to go through a multitude of things, whether you have anything, underlying, but your circumstances have put you into this position where now you are mentally stressed all the time. And it's not just a stress thing, it's that you are legitimately spread thin mentally about who you are. So that was kind of, it's it's almost saying like same but different, like it is a different sort of way for us to shape the culture we have today to be better suited to invite everyone almost, and that kind of leads us to our last big chunk here, which is the idea of shaping culture. And we've talked a lot about how these things govern personal identity, and now as young professionals, young aspiring professionals, we have to look into the future and wonder, what else can we do, what are the necessary things to keep in mind. And um I guess the first thing I want to ask is, our role as leaders and emerging people, should our job be in shaping culture, and what can we kind of do to create a more inclusive cultural environment?
Mm. No, you definitely, yeah, brought up a lot of points that resonate. Before I kind of go into it, I think it's like one of the things that I think like Pangea really like tries to like, like one of like the main messages is that, you don't integrate in a couple years, even if you're a newcomer and you've been here for like 5 years, it's a process, there's no like, there's the start, but it's like, there's no really end, like there is no like sort of like a point where you're like, okay, yeah, I'm done adjusting, like I'm a full Canadian now. And it shouldn't be like that, right? So it's sort of like, I think like for me, I've been here for like, yeah, 10 years, almost 10 years now, like half my life. And I'm still, like sort of balancing, this is my culture, but this is also my culture. And even like on a more kind of like different way, it's like, as a family, it's like we still kind of like have different challenges, and they are because we are immigrants, and maybe we like connections, or there's like social security or things like that. So it's just like, I think that idea that it's like, like there's no end point to integrating, and you shouldn't be fully integrated. Like that's not something that is going to help anyone. And I think that's one of like the main things that we as like, I think we are in a really special sort of like place, like in how we see the world, where we have those kind of intersections and we able to see things from both ends. Is that we need to like push that forward, and like show that there isn't like, in whatever field we go into, like the more different perspectives there are, the stronger that organization will be, or like the better that industry will be. And like that feeling that it's like, there is no right way to be a identity or b identity. It's like for us to really be able to do anything, or accomplish anything, or to make the world a better place, as like, like as you should do, is like to get as many different people in the room, because you by yourself will not be able to figure it out. And one thing with Canadian society is that the traditional Canadian society of like a white cis man will not solve the world's issues. That's, I think, not to get political, as we can kind of see by like a lot of like the main pressing issues that we see today. It's like there is a need for diverse voices, and empowered diverse voices more than anything. Just, and in order to be empowered, you have to be proud of who you are. And that's one of the things, like you can't take your culture away from you. And it's like, I know that it's like with assimilation, and like if you look at certain groups, there have been, that has been tried. But I think sort of like where we are now, and like how what we've hopefully learned from our history, is that is one, impossible. You can't take someone's culture completely away. That's part of who they are. That's never going to leave them, even if you isolate them. And two, that that is in your benefit. I think a lot of times, especially when we go into like diversity talks or like employment equity sort of like discussions, it's like there's this kind of sense that it's like, oh yeah, we need diverse voices. And it's like, oh, like they're gonna help, like it's almost like, oh, we're doing them a favor despite this. But it's like, it's not despite, it's because, so it's not to like this idea that like you're trying to get as many people from different cultural backgrounds. And it's like they're supposed to act like separate from their culture. Their culture is who they are, and that is one of the things that makes them strong. That's one of the things that makes their voice important, is the different lived experiences that immigrants, or even second gen immigrants, or different like minorities, different like, it doesn't even have to be in this immigrant newcomer sort of bubble, just as a society in general. um, that's, those are the things that we need. And I think you know we have to listen as well. And I think that's one of the things that's like really impacted me the most throughout this like entire journey. It's like, okay, I have all these complicated thoughts and reflections about my background, my ancestry, and like what that means, like who I am because of them. Like that's made me, sometimes like you just have to listen to people. You just have to listen to their stories, consider their personal context, and learn from each other, because there's a lot of things that unless you experience them, you won't be able to completely speak to. So because you can't experience every single thing in the world, it is sort of your responsibility to listen to people that have a background that's different than yours. So yeah, I think that's sort of like, like the greater take back of all of this. And I think that's why, I think Canada is a great country. I think we definitely have a lot to work on. I think, we have an inclusive reputation, but there is, I don't really agree that we live up to it to the point that we could. But that's sort of the way forward to live up to the values that we say we have.
Hmm. And even looking at Canadians specifically, we do a poor job kind of representing the people who are here in the first place. That being the Aboriginal people. Like there are very glaring holes that every nation can kind of go in and do the work to address. And I think that something really powerful that you said that I want to emphasize, highlight, so to say, is everyone, you got to get people in the room and they need to feel like they deserve to be there. And it is, again, way easier said than done, because sometimes it does come off as sort of like tokenism or a show, like, oh yeah, we just have the people here because that is what looks good, or that is what we believe we're capturing the important cultural perspective of X person by having them represented here today. But there are a whole different uh realms of things you can do to sort of make that an environment for people to share easily and to share openly. And I think that it's a very big question to, oh, at the end of this episode, you should know how to fix culture. No, that's not how it's supposed to work. But it's important that we do have these conversations and we start looking at, culture as not something we have to combat or sort of put on the back burner, or, actively fight like we have talked about doing, but start seeing that as your worth, and that your slice of whatever life that you're living is what people are seeking from you, and that's the value that you contribute, is where you're from and what you have to speak on it. And um, I forget who said this, it's some philosopher, but they've sort of chalked up the idea of culture and art, and that being a nation's currency. And if you were to imagine a world with no money, the only way that we would transact country to country is by our cultures and by our art. And that these things do last beyond us. So it's really important to understand that value, not only from where you've been and where your family's from, but also that you carry every single day, whether you are first, second, or whatever generation immigrant, or not even an immigrant. If you're just an underrepresented person, then understand that you have a very interesting and a very valued perspective that hopefully the world will continue to uh, understand and continue to seek out, because hopefully we have people who want the same for you. And I think that that's a beautiful note to end off before I go on another tangent about XYZ whatever. But um I think we said a lot of very important, very impactful, and a lot of very long-winded uh comments and discussions about culture as a whole. So, Isa, I'm very thankful to have you here today. And I want to give you the floor one more time just to kind of, any last words to the audience, anything you want to leave people with.
I would say sort of like maybe like the last thing is like we need more conversations like this. It's like I think it's important not to ignore where you come from, and kind of destigmatize this idea that there's the right way to be any sort of group, to be put in any sort of box. And to claim your culture doesn't mean that you have to restrict who you are. It's just simply part of you. So I'm really happy to have discussions like this. I think it's like, for me, it's definitely something that, I think a lot about, but maybe I don't talk enough about. I don't discuss it in detail like we did here. So I'm definitely really appreciative for that opportunity. But yeah, that's everything.
I hope that you have the, you know, what's the word? I hope you feel entitled to speak on your own experience with any group that you're in, because again, it's the only one you got. And I really hope that collectively we are more appreciative of the different voices that we all have, especially being uh Canadian, like let's live to the reputation. And with that, that concludes this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care.